My name's Steve Walsh, and I'm the product manager for the Notes Migrator for SharePoint product at Quest. Today we're going to be talking about a few different items: tool deployment, first and foremost, also Domino.Doc and QuickPlace and QuickR migrations. So first we're going to spend some time talking about the tool deployment options. In particular, we'll be talking about installing the import service. So as we discussed before, you can either migrate through the SharePoint 2010 web services, which is the simple installation, or you can install Quest code on your servers, which is the more complex installation, and that's the one we'll be focusing on today. Then after that, we're going to start diving into QuickPlace and QuickR migrations, as well as Domino.Doc migrations. So first, a quick review of installing the clients. Hopefully most of you have had the experience of installing the Notes Migrator for SharePoint client by now. It's really simple. We do have some prerequisites, and we run on most versions of Windows that you can think of, clients and servers alike, all the way up through the current versions. .NET Framework is required on your client workstations, and most of the Windows versions listed here already have the .NET Framework installed, but if you're stuck with an XP machine, you might actually need to download the free .NET Framework from Microsoft and install that first. And our installer will let you know if you don't have the right prerequisites. And you also need a Lotus Notes client. So our tool is a Notes API program, and we actually call into the Notes DLLs and use the Notes configuration files to connect to the Domino server. So you need to have a Lotus Notes client installed before you install our client. And we specify 504 as the minimum version. There are a few features that require R6, especially if you want good rich text extraction and embedded images and so on. So really we recommend 6 or higher. Most people have a lot higher than that by now. So probably R7 is the most common client that we use. And of course we support all the way up through 8.5 point whatever we're at today. Now, installing on the modern Windows platforms, if you have the user access control turned on Vista and 7, one thing to watch out for is that these versions of Windows kind of virtualize the program files directory. So the Notes client, which by default will install your Notes data directory in program files, that will kind of get virtualized. So every user has their own little virtual program files area. Kind of complicated, and a lot of people don't realize it's going on. If you want to keep things simple, if you're doing a fresh install, go ahead and install the Notes client outside of the program files area, in C: Lotus Notes. If you've already got Windows Notes installed and you're already using it, don't worry about that. We can work with that. It just gets a little bit more complicated when you try to figure out where your data files are, where your ini files are, and things like that. But it can work. If you're running the migration console, and most of you are, there's some additional prerequisites. The Microsoft Management Console Framework version 3 is required, and this is another free download for Microsoft. And again, the chances are pretty good you already have it on your system, but if you don't, you can download that from Microsoft. And also the Microsoft Report Viewer Control. This is an optional component if you want to run our reports that are built into our Management Console. And we showed you some of those reports in week 2 of this series. But you can download the report viewer from Microsoft. It's a kind of a plugin that's free again. And then if you want to design your own reports, and as we said, that's going to be rare, but if you do want to design your reports in our tool, we actually use the Visual Studio Report Designer that comes with most different versions of Visual Studio, as well as some of the free versions and the business development Studio that you get with SQL Server. All these versions of Visual Studio have Report Designer built in, so just make sure you get that as well. Once you've got the product installed, running the MSI, by the way, is very simple and straightforward. The only options it will prompt you for is where is your Notes data directory and program directory. So once you have this installed, you have the 3 different clients that we've talked about several times: the Designer client, the Migration console, and the command line utility. All 3 of these actually share the same configuration options, so you get to them from different ways. In the Designer client, you can just press the Options button or go to the Tools Options menu, and that will open up our Options dialog. in the migration console, when you first run the tool, and I demonstrated this on week 2, you get this first time setup wizard, which edits some of the options. But if you want to get to the full options, just go to the top Notes from Migrator for SharePoint node and right-click and run the Advanced Configuration Options action. And this will open up that same dialog with all those options. Now, if you're running the command line utility, there's actually not a way to edit the there's no way to edit the options from the command line utility. So you would actually run one of these 2 clients to set all your options and then go back and run the command line utility. All the utilities do share the same configuration file. Here's the location, if you ever need to know that, where we keep our config files. This is the main one, options.config, under your program data directory. And this is where we're going to put most things. We actually have a few other things in this program directory, the program data folder, such as the report design files and so on. And also, there's a few personal options, which are sort of per user options, we'll store in the user's app data folder. So useroptions.config would have things like your personal notes password, encrypted of course, as well as your SharePoint credentials and a few other personal things that are more user preferences. So we've already covered a lot of these configuration options in general. I wanted to put these in the slide deck so when you look at the slides later, you can see all the most important options. And I won't go through all these in great detail right now. The Notes tab has your login for Notes, and you want to set that up for the first time. If you're going to do some of the more advanced, group expansion options, you're going to want to set the group resolution server. And if your Notes documents have HTTP links that you want to recognize and treat as real doc links and use our link tracking service, you're going to want to configure all your possible URLs as in this HTTP link resolution options. We'll talk more about the SharePoint credentials in a minute. And one of the other things that people want to know about right away is the logging level. So by default, we're set, I think, to information only, but sometimes you want to turn that up to verbose if you want to debug some problem and have a lot of detailed things in your log file. But if you're also running huge jobs and you find out that you're running out of memory, you might want to turn this back down to errors only or warnings only, just to keep your log files small. So another one is allow deletion of SharePoint records. By default, this is turned off. This is a safety measure. But most people want to run migration jobs the way I've been running it in most of my demos, where I delete the prior contents of a list and remigrate the whole list. So if you want to enable that feature, you got to just turn that on in the options one time. And the rest of the options, I think we've covered user mapping options, like tracking options, and some of the discovery locations and excluded users. Now, drilling down into the SharePoint connection options, we have, as I've talked about before, several different ways to connect from the Notes clients over to the SharePoint servers. And all of our demos so far have been using the SharePoint 2010 web services. And this is by far the easiest to deploy. We just talk to the existing web services that are already on the server, and you don't have to install anything on the server. You don't have to be a central administrator to go install things, or a farm administrator. And if you're connecting to a server that's running forms-based authentication, or claims-based authentication, this is really your only choice. This is the only way you can support servers, if that's your only access mode to the server. Also, if you're migrating to Office 365 directly, then you're going to want to use the SharePoint 2010 web services. And just as a little footnote here, when I say direct, it is possible if you're using Office 365 dedicated plans, if you're one of these really big companies who has the dedicated Office 365 environment, the standard migration method is to actually not do direct migration, but to use a staging environment, and that's fine, and that's the way you probably will do the bulk of your migration if you're a direct customer. If you're a dedicated customer. But even for those customers, it is often pretty important to be able to do direct migrations for some of your migration content. So this has always been a big differentiator for our tool. The reason people QuickR tool is the ability to go directly to Office 365 for those few things that you missed in your bulk staging migration. So that's the web services, and the other main way to go is to use the Notes Migrator for SharePoint import service. And this is the service that you install on your SharePoint environment directly. You actually install Quest code on your SharePoint front-end servers. And this is necessary for SharePoint 2007 because we don't have our nice web services there in SharePoint 2007. And it's also a pretty good option for a lot of 2010 customers. And the reason is it's a lot faster. In some cases, it can be literally 5 times as fast. And, in the cases where you see the biggest differences is where you have lots of huge attachments, because when you're sending big attachments over a web service, we have to encode it and encrypt it and so on. So that's really expensive operation for huge attachments. And we have some really nice options in the import service for handling those in different ways. In particular, our out-of-band attachment handling, where we actually set up a shared folder on your network where we can temporarily move large files instead of sending them over the web service. And so by doing that, you save a lot of performance time and a lot of overhead of sending large things to the web service. Also, another reason to use the import service is that we do allow for server-side user mapping and group mapping and server-side connections to the link tracking database. So instead of each client having an XML mapping file, or each client connecting directly to Active Directory to do user mapping, or however you do the user mapping, we can centralize all this activity on the server. So now it's the server going to do the AD lookups or whatever. Similarly, you can decide that instead of having every client connect to the link tracking database, you can centralize that on the server, and then our import service does the connections to the link tracking database. So just different topologies that we'll go into in more detail here. Now finally, I want to mention that if you're still back on SharePoint 2007 and you have 32-bit SharePoint servers, there is one other option, which is very rarely used now, but you can install the Notes Migrator for SharePoint client directly on the SharePoint server, and in that case we can do a direct write. We don't even go over a web service, but very few people are in this situation anymore, so we don't mention it very often. So here's kind of a recap of what we've talked about of the simple version where we're migrating from Notes over to SharePoint using the standard Microsoft SharePoint 2010 web services. And so all of our clients are installed on top of basically a Notes installation. So we're calling into the Notes DLLs, and we're using the Notes configuration files, and then from there we're connecting to various remote Domino servers or QuickR or QuickPlace servers. And we're connecting using normal Notes traffic. Because we're going through the Notes DLLs, we just look like another Notes client, and the Domino servers don't know the difference. And we can also access local Notes databases that are copied to the workstation. But we write the data over the wire to SharePoint using the standard web services. Now we also have the user mapping source, which again may be a text file that has all the Notes users and how they map over to the AD users that SharePoint wants to see. Or we could be doing a lookup in Domino directory or Active Directory to try to correlate all the Notes names to AD names. And we have our link tracking database. So this is where we write the location of all the new documents, so that when a user clicks on a doc link, we can redirect them to the right location every time. Even if they're migrating things in different stages, we continuously kind of update the links using this database so that we can redirect people to the right place as they click on their doc links and so on. So now let's say that's not good enough and you want to install the import service. So we have a package called Notes Migrator for SharePoint Services, and these are all of our server components, and they're all packaged together in one MSI file. And if you look at the file name, there's a 32-bit version and a 64-bit version. Of course, if you're on SharePoint 2010, that's always going to be 64-bit. The prerequisites are you have basically a SharePoint server, and that's it. Nothing else is required on the server. other than SharePoint itself. And we support WSS and MOS 2007, as well as the various flavors of SharePoint 2010. So to install this, there's a good number of requirements on the server side in terms of access. So the person running the installer needs to be a machine administrator on the server, and needs to be a farm administrator and site collection administrator for the sites we're going to be deploying this stuff to. So that's a lot of requirements, and sometimes it takes a while to get that. It's one of the reasons people like the fact that we can just do the web services now, but sometimes it's worth it. So you get this access on your server, and you also need to have access to the SharePoint configuration databases. And if you're a farm administrator, you probably implicitly have that anyway in most cases. You also have to set up a service account for our import service to use. So the import service is going to be a standalone web application that's basically implements an alternative web service to the SharePoint web services. And that web application is going to run with its own Windows account, and that account needs to also have a lot of access. It needs to have access to the server, the farm, the site collection. And one good way to achieve a lot of that is to just stick that account in these worker process groups. So if you're on IIS 6, that's the IIS worker process group, and then all versions of SharePoint need to be in the WSS worker process group. So whatever account you use, be sure to add it to that group. And for this one, you need to have access not only to the SharePoint configuration databases, but also the content databases, because we're going to be migrating things, and we're running at the local level here from the web service to the SharePoint APIs, and so we really need access to the content databases as well. The SharePoint administrators are used to this because they went through all this when they set up the service account for SharePoint itself. In fact, they probably set up a bunch of service accounts when they went through this process, so they're going to understand that. Now, this is kind of a high-level description that will cover the needs for almost everybody, but if you want to get down to the nitty-gritty details, we do have a spreadsheet. I think I have it right here. We go into a lot of detail for the person running the setup program, the import service, and then what the various SharePoint website where some of our code is running, all the levels of access they need. So for example, the level of SharePoint access, the level of access to the config database and content database, access, can you connect to Active Directory, and so on. So this spreadsheet is available as a download in our download area for this talk, and also it's available on my blog, and I think it's available in Quest support link as well. There is a summary tab that kind of summarizes the recommendations similar to what I described here. So when you run the services installer, there's actually 3 different components you can choose from. The import service itself is, like I said, the standalone web application. And when you install that, you're going to have to specify where you want this IIS app to run, under what port. So typically you'd either put it on an alternate port as the one SharePoint's using. So maybe SharePoint's on port 80 and you want to put this on some other port. I think we default to 8888, but you can change that to whatever you want. Or you could specify a host header, and so it could actually be on port 80, but with a different host name as SharePoint. So again, the SharePoint administrators typically know how to deal with these decisions. And then you specify the service account you want to use. And you can install the import service on one or more of your web front-end servers, one of your SharePoint front-end servers. And people make different choices here. If you're going for high scalability, you might want to install the import service on all of your front-end servers, and then use the load dispatcher that SharePoint uses to kind of distribute traffic evenly amongst these various servers or available servers. On the other hand, other people would prefer to just put this import service on one dedicated server and maybe keep the real users off that server. And so you're not going to be slowing down the SharePoint server that SharePoint users are using, but instead you're going to be having all this work done on it. The Quest code is installed on a special dedicated front-end server, and maybe when your migration is over, you're going to remove that completely from your SharePoint farm. So we see people do it different ways. Now, the other component is the front-end services solution. This one's required for use with the import service. And basically, there's 3 components here and that all run as part of the SharePoint site. So there's a bunch of configuration pages, which are the pieces that allow you to go in the site administration and configure the import service and our other services. There's also the link redirector page. This is the piece that redirects users to the right place. It actually does the lookup in the database and redirects users to the right place. And then we have a bootstrapping page. It's a NMSP services info. You never need to worry about this, but this is part of what we install. And our clients actually look for this page and then read the configuration, and that tells the clients where to go find the import service and a few other things. So, so this is all pretty simple usually. You just run the installer once and it puts all these things in your environment. This front-end services solution is a standard SharePoint solution, and it's deployed to all your servers automatically using standard SharePoint deployment technology. So once in a while you'll see that this didn't get deployed to a certain server because that server was down. You can use the standard deployment administration, go to central administration. You can push this solution out to other servers that didn't get pushed out to the first time. So that's something to be aware of. Now there's another solution, which is an optional solution, and this is basically that same set of configuration pages, only instead of being part of the site administration, it's available in central administration. And some people prefer to do all their configuration of this tool in central administration instead, and so that's an option for them. Other people say we don't want to have to give our migration team access to central admin, so they just prefer to stick with this set right here. So when you're configuring the services, you use the configuration pages that I just mentioned, either in central admin or the site collection administration. And all these properties that we configure are stored in the site collection property bag. And then the clients, like I said, read that using that bootstrapping page. And what you're configuring there is really 2 main parts. The import service itself, and so you're going to put in for that particular site collection what import service location you want to use. And theoretically, you could have different instances of the import service used by different site collections. The import service account identity. So this is, again, the identity you're using for the import service, the service account. If you want to, you can specify that shared folder, which is the thing that gives you that high performance for large attachments, and your various group mapping options. So this is very similar to what we showed you in the client configuration before. It's just the same thing configured on the server side. And then you can also configure the link tracking service and enable that for a particular site collection. And you can do fancy things like you can specify an unusual location for your redirector page for that particular site collection, and so on. Now, here's what things look like once you've installed the import service. Instead of migrating content over the Microsoft Web Services, we're now migrating over our web service, the import service web service. And this is a Windows Communication Foundation web service, and so this is much more optimized for efficient migration use. The Microsoft Web Services are more optimized for client tools like Silverlight utilities and things like that. So we're really focused on migration, and we do a much better job performance-wise for that. And here's the front-end services solution, which has these 3 components I mentioned. And our clients will contact that, ask the services info where the import service is, and then we'll start working from there from now on. And here's the optional piece you could add into your central administration site with the other config pages. Now in this case, the user mapping source could be client-side or server-side. So if you want to, you don't have to connect every client to your user mapping source. You can just do this once on the server and have done with it. Similarly, you can do the link tracking connections either from the client or from the import service. Now, when the user is clicking on a doc link, they're actually going to hit this page in the link tracking database, and then that page will do a lookup in this database to find the documents and redirect people. So even if you're doing client-side updates of the link tracking database, you'll still need to provide a connection for this page to get to that link tracking database, just to read a read-only connection at a minimum in order to redirect people to the right place. Okay, a few tips on debugging these services. There is a test connections button in the options dialog of our client, and so that's the first line of defense to just test that you can connect to a server, and it tests a number of things, whether the import service is configured properly, whether it can connect to everything, and so on. There's also a couple of URLs in our service configuration pages, which I'll show you in a few minutes, and those will test out the import service or the link tracking service specifically, and all the connections to the databases and so on. And then if that's failing, there's actually a few URLs you can try to hit from your browser just to figure out, for example, I can connect to the import service from a browser on my server, but I can't connect to it from the client. Well, that probably means there's a firewall in between the two, or the host names that you thought you were going to be able to use don't work from the client side, things like that. So some debugging is done by just typing these URLs into the browser, and these are the same pieces that we try to test with these higher-end tools, but sometimes you get more information if you just go directly in the browser. Now, if the import service itself is not running, the import service, again, is an IIS web application. So the first thing you do is you go to IIS Manager and make sure that web app is there and that it's at the host and port that you thought it was going to be at. And then you make sure it's running. And sometimes it's a simple matter of restarting the application pool after you did the first install. And if you really can't get the application pool running, then check your IIS logs, which will probably explain the reason. It's probably the service account that you gave it doesn't have the right security or something like that. Now, one more piece to mention is that there are alternative versions of our link tracking scenario. So here's an example where we're doing the migration via a SharePoint 2010 web service, but we still wanted the full redirector page behavior. So we're going to go ahead and still install the front-end services, even though we're not installing the import service. And so we still have that. We still have to configure it. And we still have that redirector page, which will do the read of the database and redirect you. So some people like this a little better because we're not installing web apps on the front-end server. We are still installing Quest code. So if you can't even do that, if your environment is locked down so you can't even do that, we have one other solution, and that is we have a sandbox version of that redirector page. And in SharePoint 2010, the sandbox is a way for you to write very restricted code solutions, and restricted means it can't do certain things. For example, you can't connect to external databases. So this version of our link redirector page does not connect to the link tracking database, and therefore it can't really redirect you to the new SharePoint locations. It can only redirect you to notes. Well, what good is that? It's better than a broken link for all those doc links, and it provides some nice friendly page where people can go to notes or at least see that something's going on, that they're linked to a migrated document, even though they can't redirect to it. And the intention here is that that condition wouldn't last very long, because you're going to quickly go back and do your link finalization, which we talked a little bit about, and we're going to talk more about in session 6, how to do link finalization, how to manage all those doc links. So we deploy it as a sandbox safe solution, which means you don't need to get your central admin guys involved. Any site administrator can just go into the solutions gallery in site administration and can just upload the WSP file. And this is allowed in any environment. By default, SharePoint, even if it's pretty locked down, should allow sandbox solutions. We have seen exceptions to that, but even things like Office 365, and believe me, Microsoft runs a really tight ship and doesn't allow much in the way of third-party code at all. They're fine with sandbox-safe solutions because they know we're running in the sandbox. We're not going to do scary things like connect to external databases and so on. So that's a good solution for Office 365. So in that scenario, just to complete that picture, we installed the sandbox redirector on the server, and because it's restricted, it can't connect to the database, but at least it's part of a migration process that will give the users a temporary solution until you get around to finalizing the doc links, and you can finalize as often as you want. Many people finalize their doc links every night, and so we'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to some demos again here and show you in more detail how this installation process works for the import service. So I have a virtual machine running here, and this is actually a SharePoint 2007 box. The process is exactly the same for SharePoint 2007 as it is for SharePoint 2010. So when you get the product, you're probably getting it all in one big zip file. In that zip file, there'll be 4 basic components. So we have the clients installer, which is the part you install on the clients, and we have our services installer, 32-bit and 64-bit, and then we have that sandbox safe link redirector I just mentioned. So let me just take this 32-bit installer, copy that to my desktop. Okay, and then let's just run this installation program. Alrighty. So we'll accept the license agreement. And then here are the 3 components that I mentioned. The import service, the front-end services, and the administration services, which is the part that runs essential administration. So for example, if you didn't want that, you could just exclude that. Or you could say, I'll install it, but I don't want to deploy it. So this would just put the WSP file on your server, and then you could use standard SharePoint deployment to deploy your solutions. And some people like to do that. In this case, I will just take the defaults. And I'll just take the default port 8888 with no host header, which means we'll just use whatever URL is available on this machine. If I wanted to, if I was an IIS person, I had already designed the application pool I wanted this to run in, I could use an existing one. Some people even throw this functionality into the SharePoint process. Most people would want to keep that separate. It's a separate process. So they would just create a new application pool, and you can either use the service account that you already defined, or use a predefined account, and like network service or local system. So these predefined ones are easy to use. You might have to give them some more access than they have by default. And this is frankly not a best practice. This is a test environment. A best practice for most SharePoint administrators would be to create a separate service account for this purpose. So that's it. Now we're doing the installation. So what it's doing now is it's installing the IIS application and configuring that according to your roles. And now it's doing the deployment of the SharePoint solutions. And so this is our little solution package runner, which runs automatically. You can actually run this manually from the start menu if you want to, and this will give you more control. If you run it manually, you got some buttons so you can kind of add and retract solutions. This will push out. It'll do the SharePoint deployment for you. If there were a problem with solution deployment, you would have seen that dialog would have stopped and would have displayed the information, and you would have had a close button. But since it was successful, it just closed automatically. So in order to manage this tool, we're going to start Internet Explorer. Okay, so this is SharePoint 2007, like I said. Let's go to the Site Administration area. Site Settings. And if I go into my Site Collection Administration, I have the Notes Migrator for SharePoint settings. And this is our set of configuration pages for managing your SharePoint environment. So you can separately enable the import service for this site collection with link tracking service. And here I just have both of them enabled. So for the link tracking service, we have the connection to the link tracking database, and we have a little test link which will pop up a little test tool to verify that connection. And we also have some configuration options for the redirector page itself. For example, do I want to always automatically redirect users to that document, or do I want to show an information page to tell users that the fact that they're about to be redirected to a document, give them a choice as to where they want to get redirected to. For the import service, our configuration, the most important one is the address of the import service itself. And we try to set the defaults here correctly for a lot of these settings, but sometimes our tool will get this wrong, especially when we can't really guess what the host name is that external machines should be hitting. Sometimes that's not clear from the information that our code can get to. So you can, we specify, you might, if your external users need to get to a different host name or port number in order to get redirected to this import service, then you can specify that here. And also, if I was using an application pool identity other than something like network service, or I would have to specify that here as well. Now, in this case, I've decided I'm going to use that shared files folder. So what I did is I created a share on my machine under C:\import service files. I just created a folder there and then shared it out with this name. So basically, the clients are going to write large attachments using this path, the UNC path, and then because it's a local folder, the import service is going to read those attachments out of here. And then, of course, the import service cleans all those attachments up right away. And we have a little test function for the import service as well. And so that tests a lot of things. It actually contacts the import service. It makes sure that it's there, first of all, and that we can access it. And then it double checks some of your settings, like, for example, that service account you did set up as a member of the right worker process group and so on. And you can access the shared files folder. So we test a lot of the basic things that you need to know about when you're connecting this. Okay, and then the last piece is that you can set up your user mapping settings, and these are just the same settings we showed you in the client, only this is the server side. For user mapping, in this case we're using an XML file to specify all the mappings of users, and the same for groups. Okay, so that's the configuration of the import service. Now I'm going to get out of this VM, and I'm going to go into our client and try to connect to that. So if I go into my options and go to the SharePoint tab, I can see that we have environments set up from my demos before for my local SharePoint test machine, an Office 365 account that I have, and they have different connection types. I'm going to add a new one now, and this one I'll just call it my test VM, and we're going to connect to that using the import service. And I add in my site collections here, and this is the URL for the VM, one of the main site collection on my VM, and I can immediately do a test connections on that. What it's going to do is it's going to first try to connect to the SharePoint server and see if we can even access the server using our credentials. And then when that succeeds, it goes on to test whether it can read the configuration, and that was also successful, and it brought back the location of the import service. And now it's trying to contact the import service directly, and that was successful too. Now, this is a place where you might be spending some time if you've got a problematic setup. So definitely start here. This will tell you what's working and what isn't. And if it isn't working, we've tried to put in good error messages with stack traces and all sorts of things. And you can actually copy all that to the clipboard. And so when you press this button, we copy a lot of debugging information to the clipboard that you can send into Quest support, and they can help you configure this thing. So now we've got this connection here. And so I'll save this, and now I've got 3 environments here. And if I were to go to my SharePoint tab and try to select a SharePoint site, you can see now we have all the site collections from all the different environments, and it's in the background thread testing them all. So I should be able to drill down now into that SharePoint site and prove that I'm connecting to it. Okay, so let's go back to slides now. Now that we've got all of our services installed, I want to switch gears completely and talk about migrating to QuickPlace and QuickR. And for those of you who don't know, Lotus, QuickPlace, and QuickR are sort of different names for the same thing. They rebranded QuickPlace when version 8 came out, and they started calling it QuickR, but it's really the same thing. And I'm talking specifically about QuickR services for Domino. There's also a separate product from IBM called QuickR services for WebSphere. I've also heard it called QuickR for J2EE, but basically it's the non-Domino version. So we don't actually migrate that. We do support QuickR for Domino, which is what most people have. And QuickR and QuickPlace is a separate product from Lotus, from IBM now, which basically delivers a lot of the same functionality as SharePoint team sites. It's an environment where users can quickly spin up a new site and called a QuickPlace or a place, and then they can create content in that places, and they can do collaboration there. They can have discussions and document libraries and assignments and all that, just like you would have in a team site. And they can create subrooms and subrooms very easily. And so what you find in a real environment is that you might have QuickPlaces that have 200 subrooms. Now, under the covers, QuickPlace uses a notes database for every top-level room in a QuickPlace and subrooms. And so what you'll find is that you have a proliferation of sometimes hundreds or even thousands of QuickPlace databases that you need to migrate. For large environments where users are encouraged to use this, they found it very popular, just like they do in SharePoint now. And they use this for collaborating on all sorts of things. Now, QuickPlaces are completely data-driven. So you might have 1,000 QuickPlace databases. They're all going to be based on 1 or 2 notes templates in general. So that makes it all pretty consistent and pretty easy to deal with. The data-driven part is important because end users can create new sites and new lists and new menu items. All these are stored in configuration documents as opposed to creating new design elements in the notes database. So if you go into Domino Designer, you won't see these things. You have to look at the configuration documents to figure out how many folders are there and the different custom page types they have and the navigation and so on. And so we've had to write a lot of extra code to do this work for you. And so basically we try to make it really easy to go into a QuickPlace and migrate what's there. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is an entirely web-based application. So the Domino web server is rendering all these pages. You're not using the Notes client in order to get to this data. And one of the side effects of that is we're not going to find native notes rich text in QuickPlace databases. So a lot of the things we talked about for migrating rich text may or may not apply. For example, you don't have Notes.Doc links in a QuickPlace page. What you have instead is URL links that someone bookmarked one page of one QuickPlace page and they pasted it into another QuickPlace page. Fortunately, our tool, as you've seen before, can handle HTTP links just like we handle doc links. So if you configure that properly, all that will keep working. Now, when you're designing a QuickPlace or QuickR migration job, you'll find that the designer has a special UI for QuickPlace. We have a UI for selecting data. We have a predefined list of QuickPlace servers that we maintain, and we'll let you drill down into the various QuickPlaces and subrooms and so on. The scope of one migration job is going to be one room, either a top-level room or a subroom. So if you have a bunch of rooms in your QuickPlace, each one of those is going to require at least one migration job, if not multiple migration jobs. This is where the automation that we showed you in session 2 will come in really handy, and I'll be showing you more of that shortly. When you're defining the data definition, The two main parts that are different are the document selection area, where you can filter by QuickPlace page type. So QuickPlace has some basic types like pages and discussion items and tasks and calendar items and so on. So you can filter by those. You can also filter by any custom form that's used. QuickPlace also has a concept of published and unpublished documents. So you can say you want just the published documents or just the unpublished documents or both. Also, when you're selecting data fields, it's quite different because most of the data fields that you're going to be interested in you're going to get automatically because QuickPlace is so standardized. We just grab all the standard fields for you implicitly. You don't have to define them in your migration job. You really only need to specify the custom fields. Like if someone added a custom field to one of their page types, you would have to go and add that to your migration job. We do have, of course, predefined source data definitions for the various types of QuickPlace pages. So typically you'd run one migration job to migrate all the discussion stuff in a QuickPlace over to a discussion list, and another one for the calendar part, and another one for all the content pages. And once again, don't forget to configure your HTTP link detection, because that's how we're going to detect those cases where people have links between QuickPlace pages. So here's an example of what it looks like when you're designing a source data definition for QuickPlace. We have this new type of checkboxes that allow you to configure what you want to migrate, published versus unpublished documents, and specific forms and views, and so on. Now, take a minute and talk about orphans. We have something in QuickPlace, which this is not really a QuickPlace term, but we invented this for our tool. Sometimes documents are not really connected into a QuickPlace. They're sitting in the database, but you can't find them in any of the views or folders or from the menu. And so we refer to those as orphans. And so by default, if you just migrate the various views and folders, you're not going to get these documents. And so if you want to, you can explicitly ask for them to say, I want all the orphan documents. Now, we leave this off by default because we found that usually that's a lot of junk. These are things that you can't find in the menu. It probably means that no one's using it. They're not available anywhere. So there's a good chance you're not going to need them. So talk to your users about whether they want those orphan documents. So on my first tab where I define my data source, I can switch from Notes over to QuickPlace or QuickR, or later we'll show you Domino.Doc. So let's do a QuickPlace migration job. And so now when I press the select button, we're going to be selecting QuickPlaces. And so we've already predefined the server that you want to get to, and if you want to, you can add more QuickPlace servers using this dialog. So you put in the notes names of your QuickPlace servers, and then from there we just drill down into all the places that are on that QuickPlace server. So for example, My Extreme Place, you can drill down into room 101, and you can have subrooms, room 222, and so on. That's as far as we go in this case. And so you can select any one of these rooms as the source of your migration job. And I'm going to say I want to automatically load the default data definition that I got from Quest. So let's load the predefined job for pages as opposed to tasks or discussion. If I were to just immediately preview that, you'll be able to see that we get a lot of the metadata automatically, like I said. You can recognize our metadata because we always use this squiggle bracket notation for metadata that we grab automatically. So we have all the usual stuff like created by, modified by, and so on, but we also have things like the name of the page. So you don't have to migrate the subject field anymore. That's kind of predefined in QuickPlace, as well as the form name, which is really your page type, folder name, and so on. And if I want to customize this, I could go into my document selection area and say, I actually want to add orphans to this migration job, or I want to pick a specific view, or I want all the documents, including the unpublished ones. On my Data Fields tab, notice this is empty. I didn't have to define all those standard columns because, again, QuickPlace is uniform and we just grab them for you automatically. We define them for you automatically. I only would need to add the custom ones. So, for example, if I wanted to select one of the custom form fields that are defined only in this one QuickPlace, I can grab that one and add it to my migration job. And I can also add formula columns and so on. And then the SharePoint tab, I can select where I want this to go. So let's just select my local SharePoint site. And I'll call this test place pages. And I'll create that new list, add it to the quick launch. And I'm just going to load a default data definition. I'll just take the standard custom list data definition. So it's going to be a basic custom list. And on the Map Data tab, we're just going to take the defaults of mapping the name to the title and the rich text body field to the body in SharePoint. And then any attachments and images we're going to put in the attachments area. And notice we don't have objects here because this is a web application. QuickPlace doesn't have OLE objects. And that's probably good enough for now. Let's just run this job. There's a little overhead of querying a QuickPlace database. That's because our tool is reading a lot of configuration documents to kind of figure out the organization of this thing. And of course, migrating documents. So I don't need to wait for all these documents. Let's just go to this list. And here's all of our documents. Some of these had titles, some didn't. So this looked a lot better before I clicked the orphan. So these are some of the orphan documents that are just abandoned basically in the database. So these are the interesting ones. So here's an example of a Word document. And I'm remembering that I forgot to show you the QuickPlace itself. So let me do that. Let's switch over to open up another window here and go to that QuickPlace and log in. So here's what the QuickPlace site looked like. So QuickPlaces, again, are sort of like team sites. You can set up your own custom navigation area. We have different lists or libraries. Although they don't use that term, they call them folders in QuickPlace. So we have a discussion folder, for example, that has their version of a threaded discussion user interface. Here's a library, which is just another folder with documents in it. And I can see that we have subfolders, like projects folder, and then the bits folder. And then notice that we actually have links down into the subfolder. So this is a little different than you'd see in SharePoint. Usually in SharePoint, you have a link to a list, and then the folders are within that list, but you don't see those links in the menu. So just something a little different that's in QuickPlace. If I go back to this library, I can see I've got, here's one with a screenshot apparently in it. So this is a simple rich text field with an embedded image. Here's one that's actually an imported Word document. So what happens when you, in QuickPlace, it has a nice feature where you can upload a Word document and it basically builds a web page from that Word document, but it's still maintaining the Word document. So if I wanted to edit this, you basically edit the Word document itself, and then it just renders that for you. So it maintains it, and users can download. They can view the web page, or they can download the Word document. That's just one of the page types that you have in QuickPlace. Here's a more generic page. So here's a page that has one big rich text area, and then notice we have this little attachments area. So this is starting to look a lot like a SharePoint list, where you have the rich text area and then the attachments area. So usually people are thinking about migrating QuickPlace pages over to lists because that's the most similar thing you have in SharePoint. Some people do try to migrate these over to wiki pages and things like that. Usually list items are more appropriate because of the fact that some of these pages are going to have these attachments in here and so on. Now the other thing about QuickPlace is you have links to subrooms. So here's a subroom in that QuickPlace. And then that subroom has another subroom. Each subroom can have its own security. And so people will usually think about migrating rooms and subrooms to sites and subsites. So for every subroom in QuickPlace, we want to generate a subsite in SharePoint. And typically they're using the team site template for all these sites and subsites. And I guess the last thing to mention is we have a concept of pages being on the menu as well. So here is a page that's just not in any folder particularly, it's just on the menu. So, this again looks like a list item here. It's a rich text page. with a bunch of attachments, but it's attached to the top level menu instead of a folder. Now let's go back to SharePoint again and think about what we did here. We took the pages, we took all the pages in the site, we migrated them to this flat list, but we've migrated a lot of these documents, like that imported Word document. You know, we got the rendering of that Word document, plus we have the document itself as an attachment. I showed you running one migration job for QuickPlace pages, but probably you're going to want to do this at a much higher level. You know, again, imagine you have thousands of QuickPlace databases, you know, rooms and subrooms and so on. You're really going to want to use the automation features in our tool to automatically create the subsites for every subroom and automatically run a migration job. So let me show you what this looks like using the migration console. So the first thing you want to do is discover what's in these QuickPlaces. And so when you do the basic database discovery, we might recognize that it's a QuickPlace or QuickR database, but we haven't really figured out how they're organized. So when you do the database discovery, we're just looking at it like it's a normal database. We're not trying to read the configuration documents and try to figure out what is what database is a subroom of some other database and so on. So we have a separate discovery process that does that. We call it Discover QuickPlace Organization or Discover QuickR Organization, and that task will actually dig into the configuration documents and help you understand where all those databases, how all those databases fit together into a QuickPlace and a hierarchy of rooms and subrooms and so on. So normally you're just going to discover a whole server. We do have a special syntax if you want to discover just one specific place, because sometimes people don't want to discover the entire server. It might take too long if you're in a large environment. So they might just do one at a time and discover one QuickPlace. And so the syntax for that is to put a semicolon in there with a folder name. And I'll show you that in the demo. Now, when we're doing this discovery of the QuickPlace organization, a few of the rooms may remain unorganized, and the reason is we didn't necessarily have access to it. So if you see some messages that your Notes ID couldn't access a certain QuickPlace, you're probably going to want to fix that, because otherwise, you know, those databases will appear as unorganized, and you won't really be able to get a sense of how they fit together. The other reason is some QuickPlace databases are detached from the QuickPlace hierarchy. They may actually be useful databases, but they're no longer configured as subrooms of other QuickPlace sites. So they're going to appear unorganized until you go fix that up. So when we're doing analysis of a QuickPlace, you know, we do the discovery first, like I said, and then the usage analysis will include place-specific users. And this is actually a pretty important part of QuickPlaces. QuickPlaces has this cool feature where you can invite people who are not really in your Domino directory. They're basically places that are just added to this one QuickPlace. And you know, when you buy QuickPlace, there's a special way for letting users log in that are only members of one QuickPlace and not in your Domino directory. So when you're migrating that, you're going to get some specially formatted names. The distinguished name will actually have the place name as part of it, and you'll have to map those users over to SharePoint names, just like you did with all your Domino directory users. So not every organization turns this on. This is kind of an option in the environment, and so some people restrict it just to Domino directory users. Some people allow ad hoc users to be spun up just for one QuickPlace. So ask your customer whether they're doing that, and because that might complicate your migration process. Now, when you're doing the data analysis, we're actually smart about the fact that a lot of the data documents in the database are really not user documents, but they're configuration documents. And so we'll filter those out when we're doing the data analysis. And similarly, we will actually take those configuration documents into account when we're doing the design analysis. Because, like I said, all 1,000 QuickPlaces will have the exact same design. If you look at it in Domino Designer, what you're really going to care about is which places have, you know, custom page types in there and custom views defined and so on. So our design analysis will look at all that and present that information. So, for example, instead of showing you the Domino forms that you'd see in Domino Designer will show you page types. And so it's a much more useful way to think about the design of the application. Now, the automation of QuickPlaces is done with our classification system, just like I showed you in session 2 for normal notes databases. And so we have predefined technical classes for QuickPlaces and QuickPlace subrooms and QuickR places and QuickR subrooms and so on. And so these classes have some predefined settings and migration jobs that will do a lot of the work for you. We have automatically set up rules so that we're going to provision a SharePoint team site for every QuickPlace we find, and we're going to provision a subsite for every QuickPlace room within that QuickPlace, every subroom within that QuickPlace. We've also enabled automatically the migration of the Quick Launch area so that we're going to reproduce all the menus that you saw in QuickPlace in the SharePoint Quick Launch area. We'll actually can turn an option on so we blow away the old menus in the SharePoint team site and we'll replace it with the menu that looks like you had in QuickPlace. And then these classes also have migration jobs built into them, similar to the ones I showed you. We're doing the page migration, the calendar migration, the task migration, and so on. We actually have a special migration job that will migrate the welcome page of the QuickPlace over to the announcements area, because the default team site template in SharePoint, the first thing the user sees is this announcements area for the team site. So some people like to throw what used to be the welcome page into to be the first announcement in the announcements area, just so people see it right away. Of course, these are all things you can customize yourself. You can change all these settings. You can decide you don't want to run that migration job. You can change the template you want to use, and so on. So the overall process is similar to what I showed you for doing a bulk migration of a bunch of notes databases. First you do the discovery, and then you make sure you configure the link tracking service properly and the user mapping properly. And then you'd go and edit the QuickPlace and QuickR classes to do what you want to do. So at a minimum, you're going to want to assign where this stuff goes. So you'll assign the target site collection for all the QuickPlaces. So you might say that all the QuickPlaces will automatically provision subsites underneath this particular site collection. And you can also customize anything else, and so we'll talk about that in a minute. There's a lot of things you might want to customize instead of using the defaults that you got from Quest here. So once you've got your classes right, you just apply class rules to all your QuickPlace databases in our console. And so you would say, you go to the Applications node, which is where we see the QuickPlace hierarchy, and then you'll say, I want to apply class rules including all the children. And then you have an opportunity, once you've kind of applied all this predefined stuff to every single room and subroom, you have the opportunity to customize specific ones. So you might go, then after you've applied these rules, you might go edit one of the migration jobs in one particular room just to pick up that extra field that might be there or other things. And then you run the migrate to SharePoint action, which will do the migration work. And this will do everything, including provisioning the sites and the subsites, provisioning the navigation area, and of course running all the migration jobs. So things that you might want to customize instead of using the Quest defaults here, you might want to change how the subsites are named. You might want to control how the subsites get named, what the URLs are, and what site templates are used. You might want to change the permission settings. You might, for example, decide you want to map all the access control lists from the QuickPlaces over to site level permissions, or you might want to do that over at the list level, and so on. And as you saw before, there's a lot of options as to how permission mapping works, and so you can decide what you want there. You can also turn on the navigation provisioning and set some options there. You can decide whether you want that extra job to migrate the welcome page. And you can also figure out which migration jobs you want to run. So some people, they have turned off discussion lists in their subrooms, and so you might just want to remove that migration job so you don't try to do discussions for subrooms. You might want to turn on that option I showed you to migrate the orphan documents, although I'll warn you, you might get a lot of junk if you do that. But sometimes the requirement is to get everything, and so you just turn that on. You might change the permission mappings in the individual migration jobs. So for example, if you're doing mapping of the ACLs at the site level, you probably want to turn it off at the individual list level. And so you could do that here. You can also turn on document level permissions here if you want that. And you might really change things completely. Instead of migrating to list items, you might want to migrate it to pages instead, or something else. And of course, pick up any additional columns that you might be customized in your environment. If you have additional page type columns, then you can just define them either up at the technical class level, which will apply to everything, or down at the individual database level. Okay, so let's show you what this looks like in real life. And I'm going to switch over to our migration console. Now, we've already done the basic database discovery, so if I just drill down into my QuickPlace server, my VM here, you can see that, starting by technical class, we have a lot of databases that we recognize as QuickPlace databases, but the class name is QuickPlace Unorganized Content. And so what that means is we know it's a QuickPlace database, but we don't really know what it's doing yet. It could be anything. Could be a QuickPlace, it could be a subroom. And we also recognize some contacts database and administration databases as well as all the normal things like Domino administration databases and what have you that are on the server. So in order to understand this better, we want to run the other kind of discovery. So I'm going to run the Discover QuickPlace organization. And let's just turn off these, and I'll just do the discovery of this one QuickPlace. This, by the way, is the syntax, like I said, if I wanted to just discover that one QuickPlace, that extreme QuickPlace, but I'm just going to go ahead and do the whole server. And this discovery process is now scanning all those databases and reading the configuration documents and trying to understand more of them. Now, on one of the databases, you see we're up to number 19 here, we didn't have access. And so this is what an error message like that would look like. So if this were real life, I'd probably want to go figure out why I didn't have access to that and maybe rerun the discovery process. Or I can come back later and discover that just that one place separately, like I showed you. Let's just ignore the further errors and resume the task. I think there might be a couple like that in here. Oh, I guess it was just the one. So we found 24 databases that we processed and we came to understand. So now if I were to go back, which I could have just left this open, the server, and sort by class, I can see that we've now recognized these databases as top-level QuickPlace databases. So for example, here's the database that implemented that My Extreme Place QuickPlace that I showed you. And we also have these QuickPlace subrooms, which implement all the various subrooms of those QuickPlaces. And this is a small test environment. Like I said, you may easily have thousands of these in a large environment. And there were a few that were unorganized. And so this is because we had that one or two QuickPlaces that we didn't have access to. So we got those error messages that said we couldn't explore that QuickPlace. We couldn't read the configuration documents. So these remain unorganized. Now, that's interesting there that we figure out what these are. More interesting is how they all fit together. So if I look at the Applications node, I can see that under the Applications node we have a QuickPlace server now. And the Applications view of things is hierarchical. Instead of these flat views, we have this tree that we can drill down. So we have this QuickPlace server, and then here's My Extreme Place, and I can drill down into that and see the subroom and the subroom. So now we've kind of got some information about what this whole thing looks like, how it's structured. And these are still just the database records here, just displayed in a tree form. So I can still go to properties, and like we showed you a couple weeks ago, we can still look at the general properties. We can do the data analysis on these things, or I could have done the analysis in one big chunk, like we showed you in week number 2. It's very similar to what I showed you before, except like I said, for data analysis, we're excluding those configuration documents, and in the design analysis, we're really factoring in QuickPlace constructs like page types and custom fields and views and so on. Now, if I want to migrate this, I want to think about our technical classes. So let's go to our classification rules, go to the technical class rules, and let's look at the technical class rules for a QuickPlace. We've already assigned this class to a bunch of databases, and we just have to set the rules for how to migrate those things. So first thing I want to do is enable automatic target assignment for QuickPlace databases. And basically, I'm going to select a SharePoint site that I want this to go into. But notice I have this other checkbox checked here that says I want to create a subsite for every one that I find. So for every QuickPlace I find, I'm going to create a subsite. If I look at the details here, I can see that we're controlling the URL and the title and the description all using this substitution key down here. So you can see that the relative URL is coming out of the folder name of the notes topology. The title is coming out of the application name, so that'd be the QuickPlace name, and the description is using a few different components. More important, we're specifying the template that we want to use. By default, we're using the team site, but if you had some custom template in your server, you could specify that here. So some people actually would build custom templates to better mirror what the users are used to in Notes, to get the same look and feel, maybe style it the way they want, and so on. So that's a very common thing to do. So I'm going to create that team site for every QuickPlace I find, but I'm actually going to go further. I'm going to assign targets to the child applications, meaning all the subrooms, and I'm going to actually create a new subsite for every child application. And for this one, I'm going to use the blank site template. And again, you can customize this. So basically, for every one of these subrooms, we're going to create a subsite in SharePoint. So this will become a team site. This will become a blank site. And we're also going to provision the navigation area on each of these sites. And so we're going to choose the default option, which is replace the old navigation area from the team site template and just replace it with a menu that looks like what you had in QuickPlace. For migration jobs, I'm going to automatically do the migration job assignment. For performance reasons, because I know my connection to Active Directory here is slow, I'm going to just turn off the security mapping for the ACL, but normally you might want to turn that on. We're going to run these migration jobs that I mentioned for the pages, the discussion, the calendar, the tasks, and the welcome area. We'll go to the announcements area. And if I wanted to, I could customize each of these migration jobs. And so that's my rules for the top-level QuickPlace. And I need to do the same thing for the subroom. For the QuickPlace subroom, I don't need to assign the target sites because remember we're doing that recursively from the top-level QuickPlace, but I can control the migration jobs that I want to use. So for example, let's say I didn't want to run the discussion job for subrooms, I could just remove that. And I'll turn off security mapping on that. So now I've defined the rules for QuickPlaces and subrooms. So all I need to do now is go back to this place and I can say apply class rules. And important, I want to say yes, I want to do all the children. So that's the difference between doing these actions from the applications node versus the list. In the list, you multi-select a bunch of things and you run these tasks on them. Here, you can do the hierarchy. I can say, yes, I want all the children. And apply class rules has all these options. I'll just take all the defaults. So we've applied the class rules to all these databases. So now if I go into one of these, like let's look at Room 101, for example, I should see a migration target that's going to be underneath the Extreme site that we're creating and in the Room 101 subsite. And if I look at migration jobs, we're going to run those 3 migration jobs for that subroom. So now if I were to go do migrate to SharePoint, yes, I want to do it for all the children. I can see I have a bunch of work planned. We're going to provision 5 SharePoint sites. I turned off the ACL provisioning, but we're going to do the navigation area, the menus, and we're going to run the 17 migration jobs. I think that's 5 for the top site and then 3 for each of the subrooms. Let's go ahead and do that. So now we're doing the provisioning of the Extreme Place and then the subsites. So that's all the provisioning. Now we're doing the navigation area, and that's usually pretty quick. And then now we're starting to migrate content. Okay, so there's some warnings along the way. The usual things, with certain users in the QuickPlace couldn't map, for example. So that's probably enough content. We're actually got most of our pages migrated, so let's go ahead and go to that list. Take a look at what we got. So here is the site that we generated to mirror the My Extreme Place that we had. If I go to the home page, we'll see the standard, remember I provisioned a team site, we'll see this is a standard SharePoint team site. And we have the menu that mirrors what we had in the QuickPlace. So for example, I could go to that discussion area. So of course this is now the threaded discussion using the SharePoint discussion template. If I go to the library, you should see a bunch of these documents. So here's that same imported Word doc one that I showed you. And we had the same subfolders. Artist folder, this, and so on. Now one thing I want to point out here is when I click on one of these libraries, like this one or this one, we put all these things in one big pages library. So what we did under the hood is we created one big pages library which has all these other libraries in it. So this library is actually a folder inside the pages library. This was a separate QuickPlace library, sorry, a separate QuickPlace folder. We made it a folder of the one pages library. And the reason we did that is because we also wanted a place to put all the top-level pages. I go into this library of a document with links in it, and so we can see that this was a link to another QuickPlace page, but now if we click on it, it should redirect me to another SharePoint document. So we preserved all the links, even though they weren't true doc links, they were HTTP links. And I have my navigation to my subroom, so here's the Room 101 subroom, and here's the Room 222 subroom, and so on. Now, as I look at these doc links, even this navigation area is using a link tracking server. This link is going through our Quest link tracking redirector page, and it will automatically redirect you to that page. And the reason for that is, these links may be pointing to other QuickPlaces that we're not migrating yet. And so we always go through our dynamic link tracking service for even the navigation area links. Okay, so let's go back and switch gears one more time and finish up by talking about Domino.Doc. So Domino.Doc is the other source that we want to look at. And Domino.Doc is actually pretty similar to QuickPlace in that it's a special add-on product that was written on top of the Notes infrastructure, and our migration tool has some special handling for it. But you're going to recognize a lot of parallels between Domino.Doc and QuickPlace in terms of the overall migration process. There are definitely some differences here. So Domino.Doc is a document management system. and it has a lot of features that if you know SharePoint document libraries, you'll recognize these things, such as versioning and check-in, check-out, and the concept of published and unpublished documents, and so on. The metaphor in Domino.Doc is you have these document libraries, and inside a library you have the cabinets, and inside cabinets you have binders. Now, libraries usually kind of translate to a SharePoint site. People would often think of a cabinet as the same thing as a single document library in SharePoint, and then binders are really folders. Binders map over to folders very nicely. And so this is how our defaults work in our migration jobs, but of course you might have a different idea and try to reorganize things differently. Now, in the Domino.Doc world, documents are usually implemented as single file attachments. So one document in Domino.Doc is really a Word document or a PDF document that was imported into the library. And so that kind of maps really nicely to a SharePoint document library. The catch is that they're not always done that way. Sometimes Domino.Doc documents are more like a rich text notes document, where users will type in a bunch of rich text in the notes document, and they might have one attachment or multiple attachments, or sometimes no attachments. Sometimes the rich text is the document, and there's no other attachment there. So just be careful about that. Verify that the way your customer is using the document library, every document is really just one file attachment. It doesn't have all this extra stuff in it. If they do, then you're going to want to think about, instead of putting them in a document library, maybe you're going to want to put them into list items, like I showed you for QuickPlace, or document sets is a good way to put multiple documents together into a document set. And we'll be talking about that in week 7. We'll go into more detail on how to migrate the document sets. Some common customizations that you'll find in the Domino.Doc world, similar to QuickPlace, things are sort of data-driven. So you have these custom binder types, custom form types, I should have said this is a typo, custom binder types, custom document types, and custom views. So designing a Domino.Doc migration job, very similar. When you're using our designer client, you can specify Domino.Doc as the type of database, and then you have a little picker that will allow you to drill down to all the libraries and cabinets and binders. So the scope of one migration job is a cabinet. It's typically one cabinet is implemented with one or more notes database, and that's kind of virtualized. So it looks just like one cabinet, but for scalability, one cabinet might be blown out to 3 or 4 different notes databases. And so our tool just kind of handles that for you automatically. You create a migration job for the cabinet, and we'll just go through all the databases that are configured to be part of that cabinet. For the source data definition, when you're selecting documents, similar to what I showed you in QuickPlace, we have special Domino.Doc constructs that show through. Domino.Doc has versioning, so you can say I only want the major versions or minor versions, only published documents, certain document types, and so on. For the data fields, once again, all the standard data is predefined for you, so you don't have to go declare that. You only have to go specify the custom fields you want, very similar to what I showed you for QuickPlace. And once again, there's a predefined data definition that's available that has a pretty good set of defaults for migrating any document library. And here's an example of the document selection tab for Domino.Doc. Again, what versions do you want? Do you want the published version? And so on. When you want to do the bulk migration, it's a little simpler than what you saw with QuickPlace, but the concept's basically pretty similar. We have a special discovered Domino.Doc organization, which will actually go read the configuration documents and determine which databases are the library database, what's a cabinet, and what's binders within the cabinet, and so on. And we'll organize all this for you into an application node hierarchy. So again, on that applications tree, you'll see a list of all the Domino.Doc libraries, and within that, all the cabinets, and so on. And again, if you want to discover just one, there's a special syntax. This time it's an exclamation point. as part of that syntax. And you could specify the database name that's implementing a library, or you can go down to one cabinet and specify the database for one cabinet. And that's just a quick way to load in one cabinet that you want to just get into the migration console. The automation, it's a little simpler because you don't have sites and subsites in this big tree of subsites. It's just libraries and cabinets, a single level there. Our predefined classes are typically going to provision a site for the library, and then for every cabinet, it's going to create a document library in that site. So this is, instead of creating subsites, usually you just want to create another document library within that same subsite. Now, again, our defaults are focused on document libraries, but watch out for those cases where there's actually rich text that you're interested in this particular document library, in which case you might want to change that default to go to a custom list instead of a document library. So the overall migration process is very similar. You do your discovery, you edit the technical classes. Now we have technical classes for the library and the cabinet to assign the top-level URL, customize the settings, and then you apply those rules down to every database that's implemented in the document library, and then you can customize it at the individual cabinet level if you want to grab that one extra field or whatever, and then you run the bulk migrate to SharePoint function. Things that you might want to customize for one document library. Do you really want to provision a new site for every library, or do you have some other topology in mind? Do you want to change permission mappings? Do you want to now migrate all versions? I think by default we just migrate the last major version and not the minor versions. But you might want to turn that on and migrate the full version history. As you saw before, we have versioning support in our tool, so you might want to migrate all the old versions and capture all the major and minor versions. You might even want to grab the unpublished documents, so depending on your requirement, you might want to grab that. So these are the kind of things you want to talk to the customer about, as to what choices they want to make along the way. Of course, if you migrate all the old versions and all the unpublished documents, you might get some old junk in there and have a lot of disk space, so it depends on the requirement. You want to change the individual migration jobs, either to change the permissions or to migrate to a list instead of a library in some case, or do you want to do fancy things like migrate to document sets? We actually had a customer a month or two ago where they were migrating a Domino.Doc library that was implementing legal briefs. And basically, they had each binder in Domino.Doc was a legal case, and they had a master document in there in that binder, and then they had all the discovery documents in that same binder. And so what they did when they wanted to translate that over to SharePoint is they took they created one document set that had all these components in it. The main, the master document kind of got mapped over to the document set header, and then all of the discovery documents became sub-documents inside the document set. So it's a very nice solution there. I'm going to now do a discover Domino.Doc organization, and that same VM is also a Domino.Doc server. So that was a quick discovery process. There's only 4 databases implementing a document library and some cabinets there, and it's a small test server. But now, notice that when I go into the applications area, I have another applications node. So this is also one of these hierarchical database topologies where we have the Domino.Doc server, and then in this case we just have one library on that server, and then we have 3 cabinets in that library. Let me, by the way, go to this library now in Notes. So this is a Notes client application. Basically, this library has a bunch of cabinets in it, and if I drill down into the cabinet, I see a bunch of binders, and I could drill down to documents and so on. So this is basically a very simple metaphor, all implemented in the Notes UI. So what I want to do now is migrate this. Let's go look at the technical class rules for document libraries. And for the library, I'm going to assign the target site. So let's select where this is going to go. I'll just pick that same main site. And then, again, we're going to automatically create a sub-site for every library that we find. Only I'm going to use a blank site for that. And I'm going to assign the targets to the children, but note that I'm not creating sub-sites here. So this is a little different. We're just creating the site for the library, and then we're going to use the children to migrate the content. So we don't have any migration jobs for the library itself. We're just mapping the library to a site. And then if I look at the technical class for a cabinet, that's where we have the migration jobs. We have one migration job for every cabinet. And notice that we actually have a variable in the target list itself. So we go into the SharePoint target. If I just clear that out, I can say squiggle, and you see this little pop-up curly bracket, and you get this pop-up application name. So I'm going to make the application name be the new list name. And yes, I want to override the defaults there. Okay, so now basically I'm going to create multiple document libraries on that site, and each library is going to have a different name depending on the name of the cabinet. So a little different kind of topology here. But hopefully that shows you the flexibility of our tool to do things like this. So now let's apply these rules over to my document library. So I'll just pick the document library, say apply class rules. Yes, I want all the defaults. And I want to do all the children. And once again, if I were to, let's take this A to Z products, look at the properties. And so you can see the target site was set to marketing library, which came from here. But the migration jobs is going to migrate over to A to Z products, which that name came from here. So I'm going to go ahead and migrate this entire library. I'll say migrate to SharePoint. And yes, I want to do all the children. And it's just going to provision the one site and run the 3 migration jobs, one for each subroom. Let's go ahead and do that. And of course, before I started this, I could have customized the migration jobs in the individual cabinets. Again, if there was a custom field in one of my cabinets, I might have wanted to add that. So here, this is a pretty small library. Let's go to this. So you can see we provision this library. So we provision this site for the marketing library, and then we have the 3 document libraries in here. If I look at A to Z products, we have our binders, and we have all the contents that were in the binder. This one. So hopefully you see that both QuickPlace and Domino.Doc are fairly straightforward, but we give you lots of ways to customize how it's going to work along the way. And I do want to remind people that I was doing the demos with the 6.1 beta. I didn't actually show you any new features, so everything I showed you today you could have done with the shipping product, but some of the other sessions I showed you some beta features. If you want to get the beta, you're welcome to go to this URL and request to get access to the beta program. Okay, well, thank you for attending.